what Hasura does really, really well is this idea of like events and actions. And what we needed was to react to data changing and do other actions based on what data had just gone into the database. All of that information would be really weird to try to track in any way that wasn't like event driven. Um, so what Hasura gave us without having to move into any heavy backend stuff was a really straightforward way to set up event driven data management. So all of a sudden your front end skill set gets polyfilled by Hasura. All of that event driven stuff, all of that, the database scaling and uptime and management and the UI to deal with it. So you can do these permissions things. Hasura did that for you. You don't have to learn how that works anymore. You don't have to set up these permissions tables. You don't have to do any of that.
Fun fact about our streams together, they are always some technical issue happens in each of our previous streams together. So we'll see if we've actually put that to rest and if there's no technical issues. Yeah.
I believe in us this time. This is going to be the one.
Believe in us. We have an unfinished pizza shop somewhere, I believe, from a previous stream.
You're right. We definitely do.
But we're not talking about pizza today. So, Jason, for those that are not actually aware of who you are and what you do, can you explain who are you, what do you do, and who do you work for at the moment?
Yeah. So I am Jason Langsdorf. I'm the VP of Developer Experience at Netlify. I work on the part of the team that's kind of focused on helping on a bunch of different areas. So if you look at the Venn diagram of product and engineering and customer service and education and documentation, developer experience kind of sits at the center of that Venn diagram. And so we do a little bit of everything, which is a great fit for the kinds of people who get into developer experience. You know, we're engineers, but we like to work with people. We like to work with product. We like to think about how things could be better. We focus a lot on like, we're going to roll an API out. How does that actually feel to use? Is that going to support use cases that actually exist? So we team up with our research team. We team up with our customer support team and our sales engineers and try to make sure that the things that we're building as a company actually line up with what people want. And when we see people use them for real, we try to surface their frustration up into the company as well, so that we're reacting in a very proactive way and making sure that we get the best outcome for everybody involved.
So when you describe that nexus, that sounds to me like a role that gets a lot of ambitious projects with super tight deadlines at a last minute notice, both from internal motivation and external motivation.
It's a very reactive role, right? Like a lot of times what we're doing is, we'll see that, this exciting new thing just happened in the community. So a good example of this is we saw Astro get launched, and Astro is this front end framework. It has a really, really interesting architecture that allows you to build your site using something that feels like 11D, or you can build it with React or Vue or Svelte or whatever you want, and then it compiles that away and ships only HTML and CSS unless you opt in to interactivity. This is huge from a front end development standpoint, because that's kind of the holy grail of what we wanted. We shouldn't be using like big heavy front end frameworks to build a marketing site or a blog, because they're not interactive, they're informational. Those should be HTML and CSS, but it's not super fun to write in only HTML and CSS, and very few websites only have static content. Usually there is some interactivity. So we've always defaulted to, well, we should support the interactivity and then the informational stuff will be informational. And this helps you solve that problem, right? So anyway, so we saw this, we got super excited about it. Well, we got to go build stuff. So we had to go out and build demos. We got to show people how they work. And that happens, we couldn't have predicted that. We can't put that on a roadmap that like some other team is going to have a release ready to go. The new Nuxt release was the same, and Gatsby and Next, and every time they get something together, we're like, okay, great. Let's go see how we can use this thing. How do we make it work? And how do we show people how it works best? So it's that. And then on top of that, yeah, we've got internal things, product, we've got marketing releases, we've got new things coming out on Netlify that we want to tell people about. And those we get a little more notice on. Like we usually have more time to prep for that sort of thing. But yeah, it's a little bit of a scrambly job. It's one of those.
Yeah, and that's fun. I mean, there's a personality type that enjoys that, because you're an old agency guy, right? Like that's what your background was.
Once upon a time, I ran an
Once upon a
agency,
time.
from
So
2006 to 2014, something like that. It was around 10 years, however that played out.
so reactive is something you're familiar with.
Yeah, there's this guy named Simon Wardley who talks about like three archetypes of creator of people who work, and he breaks them into three buckets of like pioneers, people who want to go out and explore and they're okay with ambiguity and lack of definitions. Settlers, people who want to take something that's been like loosely explored and kind of turn it from a promising idea into a functional solution. And then people who would be called city planners, who like to take something that's mature and just optimize the heck out of it. And each of those is a specialized skill set. And there are people who want to take something that's good and make it great, and they organize the pieces and they optimize the processes. I'm so glad that those people exist, because I'm not one of them. I'm like the first. I like the first 25% of a project. I love to go into a completely undefined space and just see what's possible. Oh, you've got a problem that you don't think can be solved. Let's see if we can figure this out. And then I love to be able to hand that off to somebody who doesn't want to do that really chaotic, ambiguous work of like, all right, you have no requirements, no deadlines, no understanding, but you definitely have to deliver something. Go figure this out. And you get to take cloud-shaped ideas and completely poorly defined expectations and turn that into a working thing. That's where I live. I like handing off that to somebody who wants like, okay, we've got most of an idea here, but can we make this into a product? That's who I love to work with, is you get a good handoff. So I tend to, and that even on DX, there are people who would be more like settlers,
City planners and settlers.
And city planners. We have fewer city planners because DX is usually so reactive that nothing gets to the point where it can be like a really truly battle tested process, because the ecosystem moves too fast for that.
That's the content marketing owner, the person that owns the actual timeline.
Right. Yeah. And so we have a decent number of pioneer types and a decent number of settler types. Usually the city planners end up on marketing or engineering or product, because it's a little more stable there. They can kind of plan into the future and take some things and own them all the way. But what I love about it is that it feels complementary. Like it feels like nobody's like clamoring for each other's work. And I think that's a sign of a good working relationship, is when you've got people organized in a way that, like, when product tells you what they're going to do, your instinct isn't, oh, I want to do that. It's, I'm so glad that you're here to take care of that. Right. Like I'm so glad that you're excited about that work, because I'm excited about this work. And when I tell you what I'm going to do, I can see you get stressed out. So like, that's a good sign that you've got your team set up in the right way.
And I'm communicating that effectively, like, so that the expectations of what each person's can doing. And I mean, just to clarify for anybody who would watch us in the future, because we both tend to live more in that undefined space, and in the developer experience space, losing your hair is not actually a byproduct of that role. I want to just clarify that, since they can't see underneath your hat, but we both, I mean, maybe it belongs to the category. I don't know, but I've known great people in that space who have fantastic,
wonderful hair.
So
there's some great hair in the DevRel DX space. Like,
great hair.
Be,
yeah. But I will say that the Explorer type is also a fantastic segue to the project that we're actually here to talk about today. Because the project that you built with Hasura and with your team there at Netlify is called
Jamstack Explorers.
Jamstack Explorers. So that's like a great segue that we didn't even actually plan all that much to try to coordinate. So can you explain to me what this Jamstack Explorer space is? Because I think that actually goes together really neatly with what you're talking about, the DX side, wanting to show off what product can do, the undefined nature of a new space, and then Jamstack as a branded and unbranded community / not community, whatever term that is. You can explain that.
Yeah. So what Jamstack Explorers is an educational resource to help people get stuck into the things that are possible with the Jamstack. And based on the way you just described it, you pointed at, I think, a key problem that we have, which is that the Jamstack feels both owned and unowned. And part of that okay, most of that is because Netlify is the main driving force between a lot of the Jamstack materials. The CEO Matt Billman is the one who coined the term, and there was a lot of effort made to try to make that term happen. It was very much like Matt was like, we're going to make fetch happen, and he just went for it, right? So we did a lot of work trying to explain what is the Jamstack and trying to evolve the term and boil it down, because originally it was described as a tech stack, and then over time we realized it's not a tech stack. The Jamstack is not even a stack. It is an architectural approach. And at the core of it all the Jamstack means is that you've decoupled your front end, you have pre-compiled as much of your content as is reasonable, and you are deploying to some kind of CDN so that you don't have to have long-running servers. That's really, if you're doing that, you're using the Jamstack architecture. And the reason that we think that's important is because it has all of these great downstream effects, which we can talk a little bit more about as we start talking about how we built Jamstack Explorers. But as we've been communicating this, there have been a lot of misconceptions that come up around it because we didn't do a great job of explaining the simple architecture. We were always talking about, well, it's JavaScript and it's APIs and it's markup. But if you think about that, just about everything on the internet is JavaScript APIs and markup. Like WordPress sites are JavaScript APIs and markup when you really get down to what's on the screen. So does that mean the whole internet's Jamstack? No, of course not. So we had to back away from that and figure out, like, okay, how do we use this term that almost misleads with its name about being a stack and a certain use of technologies toward the underlying value that it offers. And the underlying value is an architecture like a monolith or microservices. Jamstack is another way of architecting a front end that is very complementary to microservices, or if you have a monolithic backend, however you decide you want to build things. If you decouple that front end, you're going to be in a better situation when you've got your front end teams out and running, to be able to like maintain and deploy and have safe deployments and rollbacks and all these things that you want when you're starting to work at scale with front ends. So anyway, so Jamstack Explorers is an attempt to both educate people about how the Jamstack works through what we call missions, which are collections of video courses where somebody will teach you how to get up and running with serverless functions. Or we had Debbie O'Brien come in and teach people about Nuxt.js. Or we had, Daniel Peary came in and talked about, I believe it was Strappy, right? So we've got these really great courses from brilliant people in the community teaching about how they can use ecosystem tools to build Jamstack projects. And the other part of it is Jamstack Explorers itself is a Jamstack app. And we wanted to show a more app-like, you log in, you've got a user account, you've got a dashboard, you can see your progress through the videos, how many minutes you've watched, how many missions you've completed. You can get badges and rewards and things like that. So there's a lot of capabilities in this site, but it's still a Jamstack app. And so we open sourced it as a way to show people, like, look, this is a pretty ambitious app. And it is a Next.js front end. That's how we built the app and the dashboard, deployed to Netlify. And in the back end, it uses Sanity, Hasura, Netlify serverless functions, and a few other things to kind of plug it all together and make it actually run. Right. So it's a fairly ambitious build, but it still uses that Jamstack architecture. And because of that, we've had it went up really fast. Like we built that thing in what felt like a couple of weeks. Like it was a pretty fast build once we figured out what we were actually planning on doing.
So when you were building out the architecture of that, and I'm going to ping you later to see if I can get a little diagram to put on the website, maybe just to help people picture that maybe a bit better. But when you were architecting that on the paper side, what was the problem that you were running into of why you even thought to go to Hasura to solve it, or what was it you were trying to fix? Because Hasura in the Jamstack space fits quite well, but maybe it wasn't everybody's first thought. That
So the thing that is really powerful about Hasura that drew me to it is that it's not something that's just trying to be a database. And I think that a lot of the solutions are either trying to solve a very specific type of content management problem, and they solve it really well. Sanity, Contentful, they're really, really, really good at building documents. And when you need to build a document, you can create a custom type, you add a bunch of fields to it, and then you're able to go to a really friendly UI. They've got webhook support, all the things that you need to manage like pages on a website or sections on a website. They're super good at that. However, we had stuff that wasn't really part of the website that we wanted to track, and we needed to do this kind of background processing. And so what Hasura does really, really well is this idea of like events and actions. And what we needed was to react to data changing and do other actions based on what data had just gone into the database. So with our dashboard, we have the idea of tracking your progress on missions, right? And in order to do that, we have a listener on the videos that it pays attention while you're watching a video. And if you hit the end of the video, we send off an event that says, hey, somebody finished this video. And once you finish the video, we want to store that somewhere. So that's not really like page data so much as it is like user data. It transcends a given document. So instead, we send it off to Hasura. We take the user's information and whatever other like metric. It's basically like a user ID, a video ID, and then a completion flag, or like the number of seconds they watched. I can't remember exactly what we're tracking, but it's like, no identifying information, just a little, well, sort of identifying information, because it's like an opaque user ID, not like their name or email or anything. A user ID and a video
something
ID.
to track those rewards belong to
Yeah,
you, but
I
you are
need
who
to
you
map
want to
your
be.
user, your user to this ID, this video ID, and whether or not you completed watching, right? And then we track that video up to the mission it's part of, so that we can say whether or not you completed the mission. Because when you complete a suite of videos, we have a different event that we fire off, and that activity is I completed a mission. So whenever one of these gets sent, what we do is we have an action or an event in Hasura that fires a serverless function. So we get the data that was created and we check to see, is this an activity? Great. If it's an activity, then we're going to run some processing. Is the activity type mission complete? If so, then we're going to continue to process. And then we do a thing where we say like, okay, somebody completed a mission. Is this the third mission they've completed? And if yes, then we send off a new piece of activity, which is an achievement. And so now we take your user ID and we associate you to an achievement of like watch 3 missions. And in doing that, you now have a new like user activity thing. And the only way you can get that is by firing off those events. So like you could probably hack it if you wanted to. I'd appreciate it if you didn't. But the way that it works is basically by doing things on the website, by interacting with the documents, your user is doing activities, and we need to keep track of the activities that are relevant to us, whether or not you watched a video, whether or not you completed a mission. And then based on that data, we can show you on your dashboard like how many minutes of content you have watched in the last however long, and what your percentage completion is on a given mission, and whether or not you've completed 3, at which point we can give you a badge that says like, you're a certified explorer. I can't remember what the badge name is, but we do little fun stuff like that so that you get achievements as you move through Jamstack Explorers. All of that information would be really weird to try to track in any way that wasn't like event driven. So what Hasura gave us, without having to move into any heavy backend stuff, was a really straightforward way to set up event-driven data management. So we have a database table for activities, and each activity has a type. And whenever the activity table changes, whenever new data gets inserted into it, I have a serverless function built on Netlify functions that gets called. So Hasura just says, I got new data. I'm going to send that entry to this serverless function. my serverless function has the right like auth stuff to make sure that it's allowed to see the data, so somebody can't just like, intercept it or whatever. And then we just check, what's the activity, what's the type, do I need to do anything? And then we can send off additional things. And each thing that we do, if we affect the database, can theoretically fire off more events. So we can create this event-driven chain of processing where we say, yeah, you had an activity, that activity merits a reward. So we'll create the reward. Now have that reward fire off an event that checks whether that reward comes with something like a Shopify discount code, or whether it comes with additional access to things on the site, right? So now you can start doing these really, really powerful things that, like, if you had asked me how to do this before I knew about Hasura, I would have been thinking like, okay, crap. All right, so I'm going to have to set up this backend, and that backend is going to have to send some kind of like a loopy thing that checks whether or not new activities have been created, and then it'll do batch processing. And there's all this stuff, right? But with serverless functions in Hasura, it was like, okay, well, actually, all right, this makes sense. I can make this work. Like this will be very straightforward for us.
Yeah, that little trigger in the back of the mind. Okay, was it called Kafka, or what was it called, or
Well, there's
something
yeah,
about
there's
a
Kafka,
rabbit,
there's like
or
RabbitQL.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
all
yeah,
these really powerful
yeah,
solutions that you can get into.
yeah.
But here's something that has been kind of getting more and more powerful to me the more and more I've thought about it, which is that with tools like Hasura and with tools like Netlify, serverless functions, the stack that we have access to as front-end developers, if you are a front-end developer and you can write about this much node code so that you can get into a serverless function, or Rust or Go or whatever language you prefer for writing your backend stuff, with just a little bit of that, you don't have to do ops, you don't have to do releases, you don't have to do scalability, you have to do like basic security, but not like hardcore lock down a box firewall security that you would have to do on like a server container or things. So all of a sudden, your front end skill set gets polyfilled by Hasura. All of that event driven stuff, all of that, the database scaling and uptime and management and the UI to deal with it. That stuff all gets abstracted away with, and especially like when you get into your permissions model, right? I can create a read-only user. That's my public access to the data. I have a write-only user. That's the event. Like, so even if somebody gets into my serverless function, they could create a new activity, but they can't read other activities, right? So you can do these permissions things. Hasura did that for you. You don't have to learn how that works anymore. You don't have to set up these permissions tables. You don't have to do any of that. And then on the Netlify side, we'll deploy the serverless functions. We'll do the scaling and make sure that your site is on a CDN so that you can basically scale this thing up to millions of simultaneous users. And you never had to think about, how does the ops work for that? How do I get this thing globally scaled? How do I make it, resilient and bulletproof? So all of a sudden, as a front end developer, you can reach just a little ways into the middle tier, and you are absolutely a full stack developer. And that feels really powerful, right? Now and like, would I say that I could go work at Facebook scale and like try to scale to billions of simultaneous? No, of course not. You need specialists when you hit a certain scale. But for 95% of businesses out there, maybe even more, we're not getting millions of concurrent users. We're not getting like, huge amounts of data ingest. We're working with the thousands, we're the tens of thousands. And for that, yeah, I'm going to run that through this sort of architecture because it's good enough and it lets me run on just me. I'm unblocked as a developer to go solve huge swaths of problems and then hand it off to just a front end team. We no longer need to coordinate across 4 teams to make sure the ops team knows how it works and the security team knows how it works. Like, they should audit, of course, take a look at it. But again, we've outsourced the hardest parts of the ops and the back end to teams that specialize in that thing. Like, I'm going to make an assumption that the best engineers in the world for securing a Hasura instance work at Hasura, right? So I get to use your knowledge. And the same with Netlify. The best engineers for getting something deployed securely and scalably on Netlify's network, they work at Netlify. So you get to rely on our backend teams to solve those problems for you so that you can go out and just build the thing that you want to build instead of having to worry about becoming. You don't have to go deeper in the stack or hire those specialists or things like that. It really frees up teams to run with a leaner team.
Yeah, I mean, we call this domain code a lot of times, right? Because what you're wanting to write is a trigger or an event that stands for a video event having occurred.
Mhm.
Like that's your domain code. That's your logic that actually impacts your business.
Mhm.
Exactly where that function is running closest to the user on the edge, or how many times per minute can it be called, or retry logic. That's not actually your business prerogative. That's not your mission that you're on. You're actually trying to
Mhm.
figure out, how do I just notify this thing that this person watched a video? And so
Right.
when you're able to scope the amount of code you're writing to business logic code, then you're building your business. You're not
Right.
building an infrastructure.
Right.
And it's not that that's not, the power's not there. Like you can set up complicated controls. You can set up very fine grained function parameters on Netlify or whatever. You can do all of that, but you don't need uh, to like dig in deep to be able to leverage these benefits of again really smart developers in both of these companies, in this case being
Yeah.
able to do the best of those pieces. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a concept that I invoke a lot of, the progressive disclosure of complexity. And when you start working on a project, one of the things that you're trying to do is minimize the time to real user feedback, right? And that's why people talk about MVPs and things like that. I don't like the idea of an MVP because sometimes that conjures in the mind shipping something broken or bad. And I think that instead we should be looking at like what's the minimum thing that can be validated or invalidated. Like what's one question that we want to answer, and then how do we ship that and get that feedback? And something that gets really challenging when you are trying to iterate quickly as a business is you're looking at, okay, we need to solve this problem. Okay, but before we can solve that problem, we got to figure out how do we, like, you talked about retry logic. Okay, we have to write some retry logic because we know that this API is flaky enough that it's going to fail 5% of the time. And so we know that's fine. It's okay. That's a thing we're going to fix later. But for now, we need to know that we'll retry this function. So now an engineer or two or three need to spend weeks on like building a really resilient retry logic that will like actually handle the thing properly and make sure that it gets retried and make sure it doesn't retry it if it was successful. And there's just a lot of like finicky little stuff that has
Yeah.
to be done right. And if it goes wrong, it's really bad. If your retry logic breaks, you either don't retry and now somebody gets like a mystery error they got to write into support. That's not good. Or your retry logic keeps retrying even though the thing succeeded. Now you've got infinite loops and chaos is happening. And, maybe somebody's racking up charges, or maybe somebody's getting a lot of credits that they weren't supposed to get, things that you really don't want to happen as your business. And so why did you write that code at all? That was code that you needed to do the thing that
To
you're
run your
actually
code.
trying to validate.
Yeah.
Right. And so that plumbing is risky. It's typically like, if you're going to ask an engineer to go and write retry logic, most of us are not going to just sit down and start to write that. We're going to go to Stack Overflow. We're going to get reference to somebody's article. We're going to go and look at that article, and we're going to copy paste their code out and then adapt it to our needs, which basically means we're outsourcing it to an expert and then doing light adaptations to make it work. Those adaptations are another surface area for things to go wrong. If we're not an expert in this space, the copy paste might not be exactly what we needed, but we might not have enough expertise to know that. Like there are lots of things that can go wrong when we take this approach of saying, well, we'll just build it ourselves because then we're sure, then we own it. And the problem is that you also then own the mistakes, you own the tech debt. And when you're asking engineers who don't have the scalability, like no engineer knows the full stack, right? Like there at this point, the industry is too big. So if you have somebody who's really, really good at building websites and you ask them to build out a scalable backend, 90% chance they know enough to get by, but not enough to do it right. I mean, that's how I feel, right? Like I can build you a great front end. You send me into the back end, I can make it work, but I guarantee you that I have missed things.
Yeah, from scratch, right? So like a backend engineer, like, well, I know how to set up a resilient stack on AWS or with these libraries, right? So they can piece together the pieces, but if you do try to go all the way down to the bytecode, it's like, yeah, there's somebody who probably can.
Yeah. Well, and the thing that gets interesting is that we're looking at, we're not talking about necessarily building it. We're not writing it in binary, right? So you're always choosing an abstraction. And I think the thing that's interesting is that with this new move toward platform as a service stuff, software as a service, where you've got things like Hasura and you've got tools like Sanity and you've got platforms like Netlify, suddenly the abstraction becomes, instead of I have to go to a platform like AWS or Azure or Google Cloud and I find all the pieces that do what I need, and then the debt that I own is configuration code to glue all that together, you can instead say websites are websites. Like for the vast majority of websites, the infrastructure that they need is identical. It needs to be available, it needs to be global, it needs to be fast, it needs to be secure. And what you're doing is you're serving HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to somebody. That doesn't have a ton of variability, no matter what your business use case is. Like if you look at the code coming out of AWS and you look at the code coming out of a static marketing site and you look at the code coming out of somebody's like completely HTML single page personal homepage where they're just showing pictures they like, the markup and the CSS and the JavaScript are going to feel largely the same. And the way that you would host and scale and deploy those, largely the same. You want to get it to a CDN. You want to make sure that somebody has, you know, a node close to them so that they get it quickly. You know, all that stuff is the same. So why write that code yourself? Why climb in and have to get the S3 bucket hooked up to Route 53, hooked up to CloudFront, hooked up to like Lambda, hooked up to all these other pieces, right? That effectively do the same thing. And the same when you get into your backend. Okay, so you're going to stand up a Postgres database, and then you're going to stand up some kind of like event queue, and then you're going to stand up this permissions model. So now you're digging into like IAM, and so suddenly you've built Hasura and Netlify, but now you own thousands of lines of configuration code that chances are you only understand 50 to 75% of it. So a lot of it is copy pasted and you're just hoping for the best. And when things break down, you have to go flip switches, and maybe you're paying for containers that are really expensive and you don't really know if you need them, but you're afraid to turn them off. Like there's all these question marks that come in when you start to bring that configuration in-house. But with something, when you choose a platform that does most of what you need, then you're only building what you said, domain code. You're building the pieces that are actually valuable to your business. And you've outsourced all of that config, all of that management, all of that tweaking to companies who have a vested interest in making that really good. If Hasura doesn't have the best configuration for managing a database and an event queue and all the little pieces of glue code that hold that together, your whole business fails, right? My business goes down for a weekend and everybody freaks out because that piece of the code we don't get, that thing we wrote, that homespun config, that failed. We all get to panic, copy paste. It's fine though. Most of the business was okay. But like Hasura, that's your job. Like you have the best people in the world. That's what you got to do. And the same at Netlify. We got to keep our network up. We got to keep your site going fast. And we're constantly investing in making that better. You're not going to have the bandwidth as an individual company with 12 employees to like constantly invest in your platform and your backend. You're just not there. No one can. It's way too expensive. So this new layer of abstraction lets us get the absolute best of the industry doing that work for us in the background and constantly improving, constantly shipping us stuff, all for significantly less than the cost of a single engineer. Like for both platforms, you could hire Netlify to do all of your front end. You could hire Hasura to do all of your back end. You're still going to spend less than an engineer, even if you get on the enterprise plan. And that to me is a really powerful argument for why small businesses, startups, and even big businesses like get on these platforms when you don't have ultra specialized needs. Like make sure you've outgrown them before you start building it in-house, because it's just super expensive. That's like dozens of engineers to run platforms like that. Like that's $1 million plus in salary, not to mention the tools themselves and the cost of goods sold. Like it's a very expensive thing to build it yourself versus $100 a month for Hasura.
And that's a lot of weekend pizza as well to have to spend.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Well, and PagerDuty and stress and turnover and like that sort of work is unforgiving and super stressful. Like SREs we should freaking, every single SRE should get a 6-week paid vacation to like the most relaxing place on earth. Like go put them in a crystal blue lagoon somewhere and just say like no cell reception. All the pagers are on, like they cook their marshmallows over a pile of burning pagers, right? Like they need like they
and then don't eat
the
them. Don't eat them.
work.
Medical disclaimer: do not eat food cooked over a pile.
Fair enough. But I'll tell you, man, like it's just thankless work, right? So
Yeah.
if you as a company founder, or if you as a leader on a team have the option to not put people through that, that's
Yeah.
really good. Like, how can you alleviate the need for PagerDuty? How can you alleviate the need for additional gates and quality checks and like all these things that start to feel bureaucratic and frustrating and lead to burnout and attrition? Like, you can get rid of that stuff if you choose the right layers of abstraction. And that's why I'm so bullish on platforms like Hasura and Netlify and like a whole host of other ones that have come into the space to just make life easier for people.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. No, I mean that. I mean, they're like, and I want to be clear. Like, there are companies that do want to do that part. We call them
mhm,
platform providers, like engineers at Netlify. They actually like that stuff, and that's what
right.
their job is.
Mhm.
And there's also companies, regulation reasons or whatever, that need to put these pieces together. But that's where tools again, like Netlify or even like Hasura, you're able to still get moving faster in these highly regulated markets as well, because you are
Mhm.
able to, you can do things on a really shallow level. You can also do things on a more like on that continual disclosure of complexity. You can say, well, I actually need to be a little more or a little more or a little more. I do need an IAM
Right.
control here. I do need a whatever here. You can do that. You can layer it on, but you
Right.
don't have to start at that deepest level. You can
Exactly.
add it as you need it, and that's what's really powerful here too. So yeah.
100%. Yeah. I think that to me feels like the biggest benefit, right? And that was why we reached for Hasura instead of trying to set up like Kafka. I mean,
Yeah.
I intellectually I understand what Kafka is. I don't even know where I would start
It's
with it though.
fun to
So
say.
yeah, right. But it's one of those things that's like, I even as long as I've been in the industry and I've worked in the back end and I've deployed containers and I've dealt with some of this kind of like, all right, let's get ready for some Black Friday. It's gonna be a mess. Let's get the extra capacity scaled up, make sure this thing survives. Um, I haven't been like deep, but I've been deep enough to know I could I could figure it out, right?
Mhm.
But what I've also learned is that figuring that stuff out is great for learning and terrible for business because it's unpredictable and it's extra it's a thing that unless you have a really strong business case for it, it's a huge liability. And there is a threshold that you'll clear where the liability outweighs whatever the other risk is, and it's a matter of trade-offs. But typically speaking, like what I found is that for a huge number of companies, the liability doesn't exceed whatever it is they think is going on. Like a lot of times it's more of like, well, I'm not quite sure what this tool does, so we're going to build our own. And
Mm.
that to me is like, okay, well then think about how much it's going to cost you to build your own. Spend 5% of that doing discovery on what the other platform does, and then ask yourself if you would actually do it differently. And do you have a business need to do it differently? And if the case of, I mean, you can spend 1% of what it would cost for a year to do that discovery. Like it is like, get the understanding of what the platform does. Don't reinvent the platform because it's easier than doing the homework. And I feel like as an industry, we definitely have a tendency to, we love building stuff. I love to build new stuff and figure out how it works. And a lot of us don't have time to do that off the clock. And
Yeah.
so sometimes we make choices that sound fun because we want to learn how that thing works. And then we make that part of our job. And then we realize that it was fun to learn and not fun to manage. And now we've got these huge maintenance headaches and tons of tech debt and things that we never, ever, ever want to deal with again. Try,
And if you want to make that a career, go into developer experience.
I mean, yeah, fair enough, right? Like you can absolutely, if you want to tinker professionally, there are
Yeah.
paths for that. But I think
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
thing that's hard is like, it is tempting to try to figure it out. That's what makes us great engineers, is that we want to see how things work. We like to pull it apart and put it back together again.
Mm.
But when you start measuring on the like true cost, the true maintenance overhead, the true stress of building something in house when you could use a platform and just get good at the platform, it really is, it's so expensive.
Yeah.
And, I say this as somebody who, early in my agency career, I tried to build my own CMS because I didn't like things about WordPress. And, there's a lot of reasons why you would say, oh, WordPress is a bad platform. But when you start building your own, you realize that, WordPress is the way it is because it'll do literally anything. And I was doing this before there were options like Sanity and Contentful and Strappy and Prismic and, all this host of things out there that'll let you do WordPress-like things. And as I was maintaining this in-house, I was like, man, I spend 80% of my time fixing this terrible CMS that I built. And that leaves me very little billable time for my clients because, I've got 100 people running on this platform now and it's broken. Like every one of those clients is going to churn if I don't fix this right now. And so it's suddenly you've got these optional emergencies, right? It's optional
Yeah.
complexity. And I had opted in because I would have rather built the thing than chosen to like admit that WordPress was good enough because my websites weren't special. I wasn't building like something that was groundbreaking or different from what WordPress did. WordPress was a perfect use case for what I was building. It was easy to hand off. It was easy to find somebody to help me. It was easy for the clients to use because there were a million resources that other people had created about how to use it. Like I got to leverage the entire community. So when I finally gave in and started using WordPress instead of my bespoke CMS, my velocity went way up. Suddenly my billable time was 80% because if they had a problem, I was like, here's an article you can watch that shows you how to solve this WordPress problem.
Yeah.
Or,
Or you
oh,
can
you
make
don't
that video and solve it for the 90% use case because
exactly.
that's structured. Yeah.
Yeah. And being a WordPress expert makes you more marketable as well, because somebody will come in and say, hey, I use WordPress. I'm like, great, I can work with it. Bring your site over here. So it's a very like, I don't know. It's one of those mindsets that it was hard for me to get to. And then once I adopted it, I was like, oh, this is actually way better because I do less of the stuff I don't like. I get to do more of the stuff I like, which is solving problems and building software, not the plumbing and the foundational work and the back end stuff that is what unblocks me to do the things I'm actually interested in.
But before we get any developers like with panic attacks by mentioning WordPress too many times, we should probably segue actually to the next point because you were talking about the discovery phase. So investing your time to look into a platform that would solve the problem you're trying to solve. And that actually is one of the topics that I wanted to request or ask you about. So when you did the discovery part, you had this situation, you had this platform, trying to loop back here. DX people love to talk. When we can go deep, we can go into really wild rabbit trails in this conversation. You had this platform, you had great what we refer to, because I was in CMS days as well. So you have what we refer to as editorial content, like the bespoke, nice touches of the video, the course material. But then you have this like user generated side. Yeah, the content that you don't want to expose necessarily to any editor to go in there and modify users' passwords like they would a title on a blog post. So you have this element that you needed to store inside of a database and trigger events to be able to both to trigger an event in the database as well as then to have those database events trigger events themselves. So you had to mutate content and then as well to say, hey, by the way, this person's now had three watches in aggregate. So you needed this kind of we refer to often as a data layer, Hasura, but you needed this data layer component. What other discovery, like whatever in your discovery process, did you consider any other tools, or what was the kind of that process?
Yeah, we looked around, and we poked at like, well, maybe I could just stand up a Postgres database or a Mongo instance or something like that. And we were happy with those solutions mostly, but then we kept coming back to like, how do we trigger things when the data changes? And I didn't want to have to set up some kind of long running polling process or something where we would like batch process. I wanted it to be as close to instantaneous as it could be. I finished watching my third mission and I go to my dashboard and I get a notification that I have earned this badge, right? It shouldn't be like tomorrow when the batch process runs, I will see my badge. And so we were looking into different ways to make that stuff work. And there were some solutions like, I think Firebase was one that we looked at that has some real-time capabilities and that was like, and I like Firebase a lot. I've done a lot of work with it. But for this particular instance, we were kind of like, how do we make this feel less proprietary, right? Like the thing that's challenging with Firebase is that you don't really interact with Firebase. You interact with Firebase's SDK, which is good when you're, if you're a JavaScript developer, but not everything that we were doing was like front end JavaScript. A lot of it was like in serverless functions, and it was kind of weird to like have this SDK all over the, like, I don't know, it just didn't quite feel as the SDK approach didn't feel like the right match for this particular use case. We really were barely using anything on the front end, right? We just send off this GraphQL call that's like, here's an activity, here's an activity, here's an activity. That's kind of how the front end works. It's just constantly firing off activities. And then on the back end, we needed to be more reactive, but it was all pretty custom stuff. Like we just needed the object of the activity, and everything else was custom. So having an SDK was like, well, it's not doing anything for us, right? So we actually just hit Hasura with the fetch API, and that felt like the right match for us for the level of complexity that we needed. Like every one of these calls is a one-off. They won't be repeated. They shouldn't be repeated. Like we don't want duplicate data. So, for us, we were like, okay, well, we don't need caching. We don't need any of the stuff that you would get if like people were making the same query over and over again. We don't need like one-to-many things because that's not how we're managing stuff. So Hasura felt like the right size of tool for what we were doing. And that was what led us to stick with it. And then as we kind of extrapolated out, okay, let's assume we get tens of thousands of people. Let's assume we get millions of people. We want to build out this feature. We want to pull it across and have the activities work across the entire Netlify suite of websites. What does that look like? Like, will Hasura grow with us? And we landed on, it was because it was just a fetch call. It was the easiest thing to socialize as well. So, I built like this tiny little helper function that wrapped the fetch call. And so you would just pass in like send activity, the name of the activity, and an optional object of whatever that stuff was. And like that was our, quote unquote SDK, was this like one little helper function for sending activity. And that made it feel really approachable to ship around because it wasn't built on a framework. So you could import it into any library and use it wherever. And because it was lightweight, it wasn't an SDK. Like it was like, okay, Hasura is a GraphQL endpoint. We can send data to that GraphQL endpoint however we want. So we can build a vanilla JS little utility that's 1 kilobyte and just pass that around wherever it needs to go. And that ended up being how we made the decision, how we landed on it and stuck with it.
And it's not a greedy tool. And just as a disclaimer, Hasura Cloud does have caching, and you can do one-to-many relationships. Just adding that into the video.
Oh yeah, sorry.
but it's not a greedy tool in that it really is just kind of a, how do you want to build with Hasura? Like it doesn't necessarily force you to follow a certain pattern, and it's not requiring any additional mental load to rethink how you would build a traditional web app and say, oh, how do I make this work with the SDK from X other platform? It's like a fetch request. I can reason about that pretty well. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
It's that like that progressive disclosure of complexity at the bottom of it. All you need is to make a fetch call. If you want to get deeper, there's more you can do. Like we did the events, but like I can write those events and you never need to know about them. You can just keep sending me activity and I can like enhance that activity however we need in the back end. Or if you want to, you can go deeper. You can write your own activities and respond to your own activities in the system by just digging a little bit deeper into Hasura. And if you want to get really deep, you can go into like the raw Postgres under the hood and do all sorts of weird stuff. And that's kind of what I liked about Hasura, is it followed my preferred mental model, which is don't make me think until I'm ready for it. And I think that Hasura does a good job of, it hands you this GraphQL endpoint and it's like, here you go, this just works. I'm like, great, that was all I needed. And then later I came back and I was like, what if I want to do this? And you're like, oh yeah, we can do that. Go over here. Right. And I like that it feels like it's designed to not to like suck you in and get you stuck, but to sort of grow with you as you realize that, oh, I want this capability as well. And Hasura's like, yeah, we got that. It's over here.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I think we have our sound bite for the talk, so that's good. I know that you're a busy person. I got two last questions, if you're okay. We got time for two questions?
I maybe one more.
Squish them. Okay.
Squish them.
Which? Okay, I think we already answered that second one. So, which features are you like using the most or the most excited about? So, events are obviously in there. Any other feature that you super love?
The events are a big one, and then we didn't use it for this particular project, but another thing that I love about Hasura is the fact that you get subscriptions more or less for free. Being able to do that real time stuff is really, really exciting, because having set up real time for a few other projects, kind of just digging into WebRTC myself and pulling out something like Socket.io, it sucks. Like, it's fine, you can get it to work, but it feels so flaky, and you always get these weird issues. And the fact that Hasura just kind of manages that for you, you can throw it together with whatever, you plug in Apollo subscriptions or Urkel subscriptions or whatever front end GraphQL library you like, and Hasura is just working already. That isn't, it's so nice. It's like such an incredible way to work. So yeah, the events feel like the killer feature, and the subscriptions are like my favorite convenience feature.
That's great.